Okay, so my name's Domini. I'll just introduce myself briefly. I'm a deputy head teacher in a very large secondary school, one of the largest in Bristol. And I've worked with Sharon for a long time in various guises. Sharon, do you want to introduce?
So I'm Sharon Porter. I was a maths teacher in a secondary school, and I have worked with Domini over the years, but obviously now doing this role as vice chair of BAMEed. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing.
Yeah, I think we wanted to start by talking about why the work that we're doing is so important in our region especially. And in Bristol, I'll talk about Bristol specifically. I'm sure you all know the legacy that exists in Bristol, and following the horrific murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests, the kind of worldwide attention that was focused on Bristol with the pulling down of the Colston statue, quite rightly so. And following on from that, the work that the city as a whole is committed to addressing racial inequality, which is very systemic in the city, and it infiltrates every part of city life. And the schools are all very committed to this work as well. They just don't know how. And so the work that we started about a year and a half ago was, along with some other key organizations in the city, is looking at how do we start addressing that. And, you know, for our young people, it's everyday life, and what happened when the Colston statue pulled down is so many of my students that I know and teach were there. They were there. They were part of that. They felt so strongly about it. And actually, we were really proud of them for being there and for standing up for what they really believed in.
So the work that we're doing with the Southwest, I'm going into other schools, and in particular, I'll give one example. There's a school in Cornwall that I'm working with, and the talking about issues of race is quite challenging. So the first thing that kind of met me when I was there, I was asked, do I know anything about Darky Day? Can you put your hands up if you've heard of Darky? Yeah, you heard correctly. Darky Day. If you've heard of that at all? Okay. So basically, Darky Day happens once a year in certain areas of Cornwall, and people, as you can imagine, they black up, they sing Al Johnson songs, they are celebrating, but I thought I'll stop the person who was telling me about this, and I went to find out a bit more. But the idea of Darky Day and just calling it Darky Day in itself, I just thought this is going to be a really hard piece of work with this school, because they're trying to change, they're trying to make their environment more safe and easier to talk about issues of race when they're not actually understanding the connotations behind having something that they are celebrating as Darky Day. So this is one of the schools I'm working with, and the work we're doing in the Southwest, it's really hitting some areas that are quite white. They're not very diverse, and the leadership teams in these schools are also very, very white. They've got governors who are also white, and some of the meetings I've been to, it's having to try and make people comfortable with my presence to be able to talk about issues of race. So this is what we're going to sort of go into a little bit as well. It is difficult talking about issues of race, and why is it difficult? There are the contextual differences. So this was part of what I was sort of talking about with you. It's the idea of having something like a Darky Day, which just struck me as absolutely ridiculous. And I was hoping I didn't flinch when this was mentioned. Maybe I did, but it's the idea, that context, where you are in the country, where you are in the world. Why is it going to be so difficult for people to talk about race? Obviously, there's the shared understanding of language. So if you're working with students, if you're working with teachers from other areas, you want to make sure that people are having that shared understanding. They are using the same meaning for the words. So obviously, the example I gave you is kind of out there, but at the same time, there will be things that, you know, even in Bristol, there are going to be slightly different ideas of what a word may mean compared to somewhere else in the country. And it's just thinking about that shared understanding within a city, within a school trust, what is actually being done. Another reason why I'd say it's quite difficult to talk about issues of race is there's just a lack of engagement. People just don't want to get involved. There's the emotive language. Sometimes it is challenging, and that in itself kind of stops people from talking because they'll think, do you know what? I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to upset somebody. And what am I going to say so I don't seem like a bad person? So it's that emotive language, and obviously the fear. They are just afraid of saying the wrong thing sometimes. So these are just some of the reasons why I was saying and pointing out really that it's difficult to talk about issues of race. And going back to my example, imagine myself as a black woman being in a school. I'm surrounded by a board of trustees and governors. Everybody's white. And I'm trying to explain to them it's not really an ideal thing to do. But for one person to come in and try and change the culture of a town, that in itself is going to be very difficult. So I will be working with that school ongoing, but it's just the idea of how can we then encourage people to talk and feel a little bit more comfortable with it. When we're looking at issues of race and talking about racial literacy, which Dom's going to come on to in a moment, it's the impact of the social norms, and they're really, really powerful. So if you could imagine as a child growing up in Cornwall and you've got Cornish parents, you've celebrated Darkie Day, for example, that's all you know. You're not going to think anything's wrong with doing that, but it's how do you then address that in schools to try to make these changes? And again, like I said, it's a really strong example, but it can apply to other things. So the social norms, this is part of some research done by Professor Derald Wing Su. He's got 3 different protocols that he's looked at that says, you know, these social norms, they're so powerful, they can affect how we behave, they can affect and impact other people. So we've got the politeness protocol, which looks at social rules. We also have the academic protocol, and this one I thought was quite interesting because it's almost saying that as educators, we're so academic, we don't really have that much of a social aspect about us, and we don't care as much. When obviously we need to have that about us. If we're in a school setting, it's a key aspect for us. The other protocol is the colorblind protocol, and I would say a lot of people obviously are aware of the fact that there are discussions where people say, I don't see race, I don't see color, and that in itself can be quite damaging. So I've sort of gone through this very quickly. There is research on this. It's very small back here, but we can share this with you later. And just really talking about issues of race. I think it's just being comfortable, challenging people, trying not to make them too uncomfortable, but it's just identifying the languages, making sure you've got that shared understanding.
I'm going to talk now very specifically, drilling down into the work that I've done with my school, because when I took up the role of regional lead for BAMEed, I thought the work has to start at home. Yeah? And my school in Bristol, very inner city, fully comprehensive school, we intake from all across the city, and we have complete diversity and students from a range of socio-economic backgrounds as well. And so that work was really important for us. And obviously what I would love to be able to do is deliver a half-day workshop on how you can start that work with your staff and your students to develop their racial literacy and be able to have these difficult conversations in school every day in your curriculum. But unfortunately, we've only got 20 minutes. So I'm literally just going to show you the process that we've gone through as a school. And obviously, people can ask any questions. I really love this diagram, and it is something that I use regularly with the staff at my school, and also when we're delivering training at other schools and institutions. It's thinking about where you are on your racial literacy development. As a school, we are about here now in my school because we've gone through these processes, and we periodically come back and check ourselves as individuals and as an organization, and for us, I'll talk in a minute. I will be explaining how we're developing our historical literacy. Can see some people taking pictures. Just stop for one sec. Yeah, it is a really powerful thing, and to just keep coming back to and seeing, are you going up there? Are you moving up that pyramid as an organisation or as an individual? This is how we began the work. As a school, we actually began work on unconscious bias about a year and a half before George Floyd's murder, because we noted some things as a senior leadership team around our data in outcomes, our data in terms of sanctions for students, behaviour, things that are a national and local picture were being reflected in our school. And we wanted to own that and do something about it. So we began the work with staff on unconscious bias. And, that was quite challenging, but it allowed us to have an inroad to talk about bias in multiple ways, racial bias, but also gender bias and class bias. It allowed us that inroad and to open the conversation. And we also mirrored that with a lot of work around restorative approaches to build positive relationships. And then we moved into starting to diversify the curriculum. And again, we started that about 3 years ago as a response to seeing what was happening in our own school and listening to the students about what they wanted, and doing a lot of student voice around that. And now where we're at is following George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matters protests, we made a commitment. As a school, we wrote a letter to all our students and our parents, our governors, our whole community, and we wrote a letter expressing our horror and our shock and our sadness and outrage. And we made a commitment, and we committed in that letter to our students the things that we would do to become an anti-racist school. And that meant that we then needed to act on that. And that's what we've been doing. We have now, we've used a framework called the Leeds Beckett Anti-Racist School Award, if anyone's heard of that. It's brilliant, and it's a really good framework to help leaders of schools create a strategic improvement plan to underpin all their school improvement planning with the work on becoming an anti-racist institution. And that's what all of that is. It's not just, let's put a little bit of Black history into the English curriculum or into the history curriculum, which we often see too much of. This is about embedding it through everything that you do. It underpins your school improvement journey and everything that you do as a school. So that's where we are at. And in terms of bringing our staff with us, this is really important because, as Sharon talked about, fear is quite overwhelming, and it can be really hampering in the direction you're trying to go in. One of the things I'm most proud of is that as a senior leadership team, we have undertaken a coaching program, 18-month coaching program called Race, Identity and School Leadership, which is by Integrity Coaching. And actually, it's emotional, it's painful, and I should say I'm the only senior leader of colour on the team, which is quite typical in our region. And it has been really powerful to watch my colleagues, my white colleagues, embrace this work, really come to a realization about their own identity, their own white identity and what it's meant for them, and how then that has positioned their views of race. And what I'm most proud of is that they now lead a lot of the work. It's not just me, because before it was just me. Equalities, diversity, inclusion always sat with me, the person of colour in the school, and that's been my experience for a long time. But now it's led by them with a predominantly white staff, and they have the confidence to do that. I've talked a little bit about how one of the early things that we did with our curriculum is looking at representation. And it wasn't just the curriculum, it's everything. It's the images on our website, the images in textbooks that we use. I like to say it's the accents that you expose students to. Why does the accent that you teach children in always have to sound like me, or sound like somebody who's born and raised in England? It doesn't. So the images around the school as well, the displays around the school. So that's the easy bit, though, right? Putting in representation into the curriculum around the school, in our recruitment, that's a little bit more challenging, but we've done a lot of work on that as well. That's the slightly easier bit. The next step, and I suppose these two go in tandem, is removing barriers. I talk a lot, I give a lot of examples about English idioms that still completely flummox me. I get them completely mixed up. I was not raised in a home environment that used English idioms. And people laugh at me sometimes, but they know. They sometimes explain. Sometimes I write them on post-it notes when I come across a new idiom, stick them around my computer so I can learn them. For example, a colleague once told me to go under the stairwell. It's not an idiom, but I didn't know what a stairwell was. I knew what stairs were. I knew what a well was, but I'd never heard the word stairwell before, and I'm 43 years old. And I'm an English teacher. I read a lot, and somehow I'd never come across the word stairwell. So it's just about recognizing that we have the different backgrounds. So I use examples like all the time with staff, so that they're just aware. It's also recognizing intersectionality. We do a lot of work around that, and that is really relevant in our school because, unfortunately, where we're located in the city, if you are white, you are most likely to be from a middle-class background living immediately around the school with parents who are doctors, lawyers. We're right next to a hospital, professors. We're on the campus of Bristol University, and then if you are black or Asian student in our school, you're most likely, but not always, to have travelled from the other side of the city, from an area that is a bit more disadvantaged, and that you don't feel that the school is where you grow up and the environment that you're used to. So we talk about all of that, mitigating disadvantage as well. Where we're at now as a school, this is the most challenging bit, okay? And this is what I say to the staff, is that this is where we will really develop our racial literacy as a school, that we start to challenge and change what we know. We start to think about, we really start to understand colonization. People think they know what colonization is, but many people have not really looked at how it developed and then the legacy it's left and perseveres in our society. So thinking about food, music, things that we take for granted, that we even celebrate, but where did it actually come from? How did that come to be here? And then I ask staff to start disrupting that narrative. And I give lots of examples, personal examples. I'll give you an example. My husband is Nigerian, and we went to the British Museum, to the exhibition in the basement, the Africa exhibition, and we looked at the Benin statues and the descriptions on the plaques for the Benin statues. And my husband started to tell me a different story than what was written on the plaques. A story that he had grown up with in his schools, with his ancestors, his parents. And it's exactly like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie says, we have to be wary of the single story, the danger of the single story. And it's so important. We also have to teach our children how to challenge how knowledge is created. We have to link knowledge and power. We have to go back and think about that and think about, the knowledge that we know in the West, the knowledge that we teach, that's come from systemic and historic power structures. And we need to talk about that, and we need to have the language to do that, okay? Right, I'm going to have to stop here, okay? Because I didn't realise 20 minutes.
As I said, we can go on for hours, and this is really powerful. So thank you so much.